Greetings, abstraction students. I hope this finds you well. Welcome to week number 3, and we'll be exploring German Expressionism and the crisis of subjectivity. I want to talk to you a little bit about your readings and give you a framework for how I want you to be thinking about this week. From this week on, we'll be focusing our attention. We'll be exploring the question of abstraction through particular avant-garde movements. And so this week is German Expressionism, and it'll be the locus for which, historical locus for which for us to think through some of these more philosophical, theological, and existential issues in terms of what abstraction is and how painting participates in this human effort to understand and reconcile oneself with the world. So in your readings, this textbook, read the introduction, Expressionism and the Crisis of Subjectivity, the question of the person in relationship to the world. One of the things that you could say is that the existential condition of humanity is the I thrown into the world, the hostility of the world, the fear of the world, the concern for food and clothing and protection that we as human beings have to fight to be able to achieve a survival. And so the world is seen as oppositional to us. And it's scary, and it's unknown, and it's mysterious, and we don't know its ways, and we feel our vulnerability. And you could say what cultural history is a way to reconcile ourselves with that, to find ways to make peace with it, to find ways to take comfort in it, even to celebrate it. And that religion in general and Christianity, the role of the church as an historical phenomenon, is a way to provide that comfort, that instead of seeing nature against us, we can see and feel and experience or believe that there is a God with us. Now, what the Enlightenment does and what the emergence of modernity tears down is that framework of reconciliation, that framework of unity, or not unity there, because there is enmity, there is death, there is privation, there are plagues, there are earthquakes, but that there is a way to understand it as part of a broader benevolence of a God who loves us. But what the Enlightenment does in modernity, it tears that down, it crumbles it, and so it has to be rebuilt again. In some cases, the building needs to be simply built back up again, or it needs to be built from scratch. And the emergence of abstraction in the visual arts, particularly in this time that we're looking at with German Expressionism, the first 2 decades of the 20th century in Central Europe. We have not only the church as an edifice that has been torn down or has been partially torn down in different ways, that needs to be built back up again. finding new ways to finding ways beyond the church or theology or religion to be able to reconcile us to a hostile world. But you have the First World War. You have incredible crisis. And so the threat to subjectivity, the threat of the world, of nature, as human beings, and the basic question in the Enlightenment is how, and undergirds much of modern philosophy, is the human being is part of nature, but also not part of nature, because the very act of self-consciousness and reflection separates the human being from nature. And the question is, how does that relationship occur? How are we a part of nature, and how are we not a part of nature? And what does that mean to be not part of nature? Or is simply our self-consciousness and capacity for reflection merely just a biological, is still a part of nature? Just a development, an evolution. It's biologically accounted for, not theologically accounted for example, that we are created in God's image, etc., etc. And so what the artists are doing, the Germans, the German expressionists, are responding, using the visual arts to respond to this, not just a cultural crisis, but an existential crisis. And keep in mind that the First World War for the Germans, for the Europeans, is not being fought at the way we who've grown up thinking about war, and particularly in the United States, that our involvement in World War II takes place at some other theater, some stage, someplace in the world, and our being at war doesn't affect us concretely at home in the same way. Keep in mind that for the French and the Germans in the First World War, that the battlefields were miles away, just miles away. Soldiers could go home on the weekends. The fighting, the killing was taking place in their backyard. And so the presence of death, the presence of this existential crisis is intense. And what it seems that in terms of cultural history, what the visual arts do, the visual arts are representing, are responding to social conditions and political conditions and cultural conditions. And that if the instability of the world is experienced, if the world is experienced as unstable, vulnerable, fragile, that is going to be responded to, reflected in the visual arts. And so the question, and what abstraction is focusing on realities that are deeper than what we see in the waking world and our observable world. There's an inner reality. And there is truth that we can't see and touch, but that we know is there, or that we believe is there. And what you could say with abstraction in the visual arts is that it is making materially present what is believed to be there. Psychic realities, emotional realities. A deeper truth. Something behind the killing, beyond it. And in some ways you could say that German expressionism, that abstraction is a secular theology in paint. It is attempting to find order amid chaos. It is finding an attempt to find a deeper unity, a deeper reconciliation with the world. And the samples of the texts that I also have provided for you, the German scholar Wilhelm Wöhringer published his doctoral dissertation in 1906 called Abstraction and Empathy. And it attempts to sketch out two different ways that the visual arts respond to the world that reflect two different ways of understanding the world. One is the classical Renaissance way, that the response is a view that we are reconciled with nature. We are reconciled with the world, and it plays itself out in this Albertian picture window, that nature and what we observe, we're reconciled to it. It relates to us. It makes sense to us. We stand on a solid foundation as we experience it and interact with it. It's idealized in order to emphasize even more our reconciliation with it. And there's another art form, what Wöhringer calls the will to abstraction, and he sees that manifest in so-called primitive cultures. And keep in mind the role of primitivism, the role of looking at cultures outside of European Western framework is crucially important. It's important to find a way. It's important as a response to what is perceived as the weaknesses, the crises of Western culture, the church, civilized life, the Industrial Revolution, modern innovations. We have later in the 19th century, Gauguin is going to Tahiti. Melville is in the Peloponnesian Islands in the (1830s). He's shocked by how the Polynesian culture operates completely outside of any monotheistic religious context, and he sees a certain kind of harmony in their social organization that has a very important impact on him. But in the art of so-called primitive cultures, for Wöhringer, it's African tribal work that he sees in the museums in Paris, the same museums that Picasso is going to, that will be important for this story of the unfolding of abstraction. But Wöhringer then sees this other way of this other art that is coming out of a response to the world that does not see itself reconciled with it, at one with it, but that its relationship is a tense one, a fearful one. It's unstable and unpredictable. And so it reflects an inner anxiety and a desire somehow and in some way to control that world, to abstract it in a way that simplifies it, that freezes it, that puts it at a distance that it can be approached, that it can be, in some ways, it's even venerated, that it emphasizes that it's a manifestation of anxiety, and that art is a means by which the anxiety is dealt with in an apotropaic way, which means in a defensive way. And that the arts and the visual arts in this context are presenting a different kind of response, which call for a different formal organization, which call for different skills and techniques. That Voringer argues are not inferior to classical and Renaissance techniques, they are different. And Voringer's thesis has an important impact on the development of modernism, because he makes no reference to modern artists. The introduction that I'm asking you to read is by the modernist art critic Hilton Kramer, who sets out the context for it. And then I've also included are the several prefaces of the various editions that Voringer, the prefaces that Voringer wrote for these various editions that emphasize the impact of this book as it makes its way in German, in translation, in English in I think the early 1950s. That it provides a certain kind of philosophical and apparatus to understand why African masks look the way they do. And not because these artisans lack the technical training of a Raphael, but that the technical training is of a different kind, and that the artifacts are doing different things. So one thing that's interesting to think about for the German expressionists, for example, or abstraction, is how does abstract painting reconnect with that deep sense of being at enmity with the world? And also, it's not just this isn't just a philosophical or an essentialist argument. The development of abstract painting is taking place in history. It's taking place in response to historical events. There are artists that are going to the front line and being killed on the battlefield. There are soldiers who are artists that are going to the battlefield that return alive, completely changed. Picasso and his close friend Georges Braque suffered this. Georges Braque was an officer for the French in the First World War, and Picasso, as a Spaniard, was exempt from serving. Braque goes to the front, is seriously wounded. In fact, he spends an entire day and night laying wounded in no man's land. He returns, but tremendously and deeply affected. Picasso said about it that his friend Georges Braque went to the war and his friend never returned. That's what they're responding to. And that somehow and in some way, painting the way the academicians painted, painting the way David painted, painting the way Raphael painted, somehow didn't respond with authenticity and integrity to the moment of lived experience, that the world is not that way. So I hope these thoughts are helpful to you to kind of set out our context. I will be looking forward to reading your discussion prompts, and I'll be responding with another video chat at the end of the week on Friday. As always, write me if you have any questions whatsoever. I want to be in dialogue with you. Again, submit your discussion prompts to me either directly through email or post it on Canvas if you want some of your colleagues to interact. I hope the Canvas platform is helping you. If you are interested in utilizing it, let me know if there are problems with it. And Have a great week. Take care.